Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So, today we're going to be talking about positionality. And normally, the conversation on positionality centers around an author who's very important named Gayatri Spivak, or Spivak is how the family that I grew up near uh, pronounced their name, but Gayatri refers to herself as Gayatri Spivak. And Gayatri Spivak wrote this conversation around the word subaltern, Subaltern. And the idea of a subaltern is someone who is essentially so marginalized by the institution that they have no voice within that institution. And the text, Can the Subaltern Speak, although incredibly generative with ideas and criticisms of a lot of really awesome thinkers like Derrida and Foucault, still is 60 pages long. And although I find it really, it's a lot to chew on and it's really a fantastic read, I felt that by breaking the ideas down across um, the writings of several authors was a little bit better of a way to get you all into the conversation on positional art or positionality within art. Um, yes, positionality is a word, so just roll with it. It is the position that you take, but it is also the position that you find yourself in. And so it is both something that you enact and something that is enacted upon you. That's the thing about positionality that makes it different from, say, having an opinion on a matter. It's the way that the world affects your ability to have that opinion. Now, Gayatri Spivak's conversation deals with one specific enclave of South Asian female citizens, essentially marginalized, subalternated women in uh, the Indian subcontinent, and whether or not they have rights, and whether or not they have the ability to speak and articulate the need for those rights or the need for the conversation or the need for their voice in conversations. And so I was inspired by that and decided that I would um, focus this cache on positionality, but specifically what one specific positionality that is, that being the Islamic woman. Now, I'm not an Islamic woman. I'm not Islamic. I'm not a woman. And so, quite obviously, I'm going to be speaking about the work of these artists who are also not all women, who are also not all Islamic, but are making artwork in and around the Islamic world. Um, so, I'm going to be speaking about a lot of these works from other angles. Uh, and as I've seen many of you do in your writings as well. So, um, here we are. We're looking at a work by Nuri excuse me. Um, And I will say that I encountered a lot of these works while visiting Istanbul last spring. I went to Istanbul Modern, which is their modern art museum, and they had a really broad survey of workup that stemmed from the 1940s up to the contemporary moment. And I was really taken by the variety of work that was shown. A lot of the work had or was kind of within timely conversation within European art, and often European art as a monolithic culture doesn't allow other cultures to speak as loudly as it allows itself. And so while we see geometric abstraction coming out of a lot of countries in the latter part of the 20th century, we don't really talk about it as coming out of the Islamic world. We don't really talk about what those cultures are developing, because those cultures are very foreign to us. Not only are the customs and languages very foreign, but the way that the cultures themselves are shaped is very foreign. And I felt that it would be a particularly interesting way to talk about positionality to twice remove us from the ability from knowing the lives of these people. Essentially, what I'm getting around through all this blabbling to say is that by looking at the lives and artwork produced in and around Islamic femininity, I'm essentially getting all of us away from a conversation that we think we know. Yes, some people that are in this conversation are women, but I don't, to my knowledge, understand any of you as being Islamic women. Yes, some of the people in this conversation are hold true and hold dear religious sentiments, but as far as I can tell, none of those sentiments are based on Quranic texts. And so what we have is this really interesting idea to a really interesting potential of observing cultural pronouncements or enunciations from cultures that we are not necessarily related to. And that was really what the experience of going to Istanbul Modern was. I was an insider because I could understand and read the cultural cues of the development of artwork, but I was an outsider because I didn't understand quite the nuance that the Islamic culture was putting into the work. Now, you might see all these artworks and think to yourself, well, there's not that much nuance here. It's all pretty aggressively about the Islamic world. And I don't mean aggressively in that it's saying the Islamic world is aggressive. I mean that it takes up its Islamic disposition very proudly and very boldly and very directly. And so even in a work like this by EM, we have a woman who's the mere fact of her hair being partially covered signifies so much about the culture that she is making this work in, making this work for, and making this work about. And all of the artists that we're going to look at are having that conversation. Now, that said, not all of the work that we're looking at can be shown in a lot of places in the Islamic world. And that's a that's just something we're going to have to be talking about today. Um, and so, rather than kind of go through and labor over the individual practices of each of these works, because that could essentially take us about 2.5 hours, and that's a really long time for one of these video lectures, I thought that it would make a little bit more sense to go give you kind of a broad view, and then move forward. So a few things, just some brass tack stuff. So many of you recognize that I'm not in the office anymore in this little video, which is probably about the size of a thumbnail on your computer screen, or even smaller if you're savvy and watching it on a smartphone, which would be insane. I mean, yeah, you could watch this on a smartphone, listen to it while you're at the gym, which would be really weird for me to think about you all listening to this at the gym. Anyway, the reason why I'm in my kitchen and not at the office is that every time I record this lecture on positional politics, on the discourses surrounding feminism, I always want to anchor myself in my kitchen. And I do that very specifically as my shout out to Martha Rosler and her seminal, wonderful project, Semiotics of the Kitchen, which Crystal brought up this summer. And Crystal, if I'm crediting you and you wasn't you, then I apologize to the student who did bring it up. But I'm almost positive that it was you that brought it up this summer. But the summer was a long time ago, and it was very intense, as we all know. But anyway, in this video, what Martha Rosler puts out is a conversation or a butting of heads between really heady intellectual prowess, i.e., semiotics, how language works, how meaning works, how cultural conversations can happen on one camp, and then how we have the feminine world of the kitchen, the feminine world of the domestic. And Rosler in the video talks about the incongruent relationship between these two entities. There's a border that's really strong and potent between these two, where semiotics has a hard time finding its way into domestic application. And domestic application has a hard time reconciling itself with feminine domestic worlds. What Rosler put out in that video was essentially, it's not that they're incongruent, it's that too often people are trying too hard to make sure they remain apart, to make sure that the cultural developments of something like semiotics are distanced from the natural elements of something like a domestic. So here we have conversations between the cultural and the natural, i.e., the male and the female. Now, I've gotten 10 minutes into this lecture without giving you the wonderful news that if you figured out that Akrim Bogrami's text on fundamentalism was the text that was unreadable, because man, that guy can repeat himself, but man, what a wonderful text that was. But I say that to bring it to the text that I think is actually a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful piece of research documentation, a wonderful, very readable, very, how do I say this? I mean, Sherry B. Ortner kills it. That's the only way you can talk about that essay. And Sarah, you and I ran into each other a few weeks ago now in the hall, and you said that this was really a great text for you to read. And um, it's I love assigning this text because she and Susan Hiller really do just like they state all of the things that I think about how these kind of cultural conversations exist. That there is on one side this idea that there is a natural order to the world, and on the other side that there is a cultural development, and that those two things occupy very um, broad places in our psychology. What does that mean? We're trained to understand how culture works, and we're trained to understand how nature works. We're at a point now where nature really doesn't exist in the terms we want it to. We fantasize about a nature that exists, but it doesn't actually exist. Both of those things are cultural. But within that cultural conversation, there is this kind of fake distance. This and Ortner says it at the very end of her text. And I know I'm getting kind of like bouncing all over the place, but stick with me. At the tail end of her argument, she says, ultimately, of course, it must be stressed that the whole scheme is a construct of culture rather than a given of nature. She goes on to say, woman is not, in reality, any closer to nor farther from nature than man. Both have consciousness, both are mortal. But there are certainly reasons why she appears to be that way. The result is a vicious circle. Various aspects of woman's situation, physical, social, psychological, lead her to being seen as closer to nature, while the view of her as closer to nature is embodied in institutional forms that regenerate her situation. This is the meat of it. The implications for social change are similarly circular. A different cultural view can grow only out of a different social actuality. A different social actuality can grow only out of a different cultural view. Culture then becomes hegemonic. It becomes a structure in which all of us participate. It becomes a culture in which both male and female citizens reify the rules. Now, we're seeing this play out along conservative and liberal party lines because we're leading constantly towards a presidential election. It's like every time I turn around, there's another presidential election to think about. It's just like, I don't care. Somebody run the country. I actually do care quite a lot, and all of you should as well. All of you should vote. If you don't vote, I don't even know why you're getting an MFA, quite honestly. Truth. But what Ortner's getting at in that text is that we're all participating in this. And I bring that up before we get into the work because a lot of people outside of Islamic nations see the struggle of women in Islamic nations and say to themselves, well, they can change it. And all of us, all 11 of us, understand that that's not the case. All 11 of us, understand that culture and hegemony her hegemony, or however you want to pronounce that word. I always say hegemony, but I say it incorrectly. It's hegemony. But and hegemony are they're very powerful things that you, when you're born of whatever gender, you're given essentially a role to play. And for Martha Rosler, that role as a woman existed in the kitchen, but as an artist, it existed outside the kitchen in the world of semiotics. And so she found a way to bring those two things together, to make them have a conversation with one another. In the Islamic world, a lot of women and a lot of the female artists that I'm pointing out to you today are finding ways to bring the voice that they feel is lacking across their culture to women, specifically a woman's voice, to an art audience, whether that's in their country or outside of their country. Now, the whole of this deals also with the Battle of Algiers, which is, which is a film I hope all of you are able to watch. Louise, I'm sorry that I never responded to your email about the link for the film. When I assigned the film, there were two versions that were available for free online. One was on YouTube and one was on another website, but they were really easily searchable. And so if those links have gone dead, because I know that YouTube, like other services, cycles through the videos that it offers, I really sincerely apologize. For those of you who are not able to see the film, I strongly recommend seeing the film, especially after this lecture, because it might, you'll see it in different terms. But in that film, The Battle of Algiers, one of the things that I find really, and spoiler alert, the women have so much authority in that film. The women, in their ability, in their invisibility, by being invisible, they're able to stoke a revolution. They're able to facilitate a revolution, even if they're not the ones who are in the meetings, pounding desks and rallying the male troops. They're the ones, and as is often the case with that ridiculous adage that behind every great man is a great woman, behind every great person is a great community of people, is actually the way it should be. And when we get into the conversation next week about collaboration and performance, that's going to be the part of it. But that film indicates so thoroughly, in a way that a lot of these artworks are trying to point out. But because film has a different capacity to tell stories, it has a different ability to tell this story. So it really does just put out there that you might think that women have no role in the Islamic world. You might think or assume that women in whatever role they are given have no authority, even if they are given a role, that role has no authority, excuse me. But what is actually the case is that in every society, every person has a very distinct role. And every role has, at its core, some level of shuffling power around. You can destabilize structures by even being passive within them, which is, of course, not at all what the women in the Battle of Algiers were doing. They were being very active, and they were doing everything they possibly could to make sure that this revolution was occurring. And so they were taking what was seen as kind of an invisible role and turning it into something that was, albeit still invisible, very direct and very aggressive towards their colonizing agent. So if you haven't seen that, please see it. I'm going to pause real quick and then get back into this. All right, so I just said like 100 different things, right? But it's all there and it's all good. So I want to move to this idea. So marginality. Because marginality is really the reason why we have conversations about feminism. It's the reasons why we have conversations about positionality. It's the reason why we have a lot of these conversations. There was a point in the world when, no, there wasn't. Actually, that's a total lie. At a certain point in history, one group of powerful people, we can call those people the 1%. We can call them white dudes. We can call them colonizers. We can call them villains. You can call them heroes. I don't know what you want to call them, but there's a point in time when a bunch of people who were generally European, wealthy, white males, landowning males, that comes with wealth, who said everything. They said absolutely everything, and that was it. That was period. That was it. No other variance was allowed. And eventually, what began to happen is people who existed on the fringes, in the margins, began to speak. And when the population demanded rights before the law, the Magna Carta was drafted, which is the establishment of legal human rights in European history. And that was about marginality. That was about people outside of the hegemonic authorities who were wanting some sort of participation in that authority or in that population. Now, so it's when, and this comes from Susan Hiller. So you all have read this, so this quote should make sense to you. But marginality means that you internalize two conflicting but sometimes overlapping sets of ideas about everything. And then she goes on to say, I'm a marginalized person because as a woman in this culture, the culture of the 1980s in Euro-American culture, in this culture, I do not have a female language. I am excluded from culture and from cultural traditions unless I speak like a man. I really like this definition of marginality because it's important to think about what it means to speak. In order for the citizens to speak before the king, they needed something like the Magna Carta to put their voice into the terms that the king could understand. This happens today in the exact same way. All of us, all people, are actually marginalized from the justice system. All people, before a judge, are asked to speak through a lawyer. That lawyer translates our conversations for the judge and for legal documentation. Unless we speak of that culture as that culture, we have no voice. And all of us, even when we're watching Law and Order, understand what it means that if you can't, no one can stand up in the back of the courtroom and shout something like "he's innocent" or whatever. It was a really shrillish cry. I mean it. He's innocent. But you can't do that. The court will shut you down. The court will not allow that conversation into its record or into its consideration. The court has its rules, all of which exclude everyone, except for people who enter into those conversations according to those languages. So in this conversation about marginality and positionality, it's important to understand that at different points in all of our lives, we embody what it is to be marginalized. Now, enunciation. This is another word that Hiller brings up, and it's not exactly the broadest use of this word or definition for this word, but I think within this conversation it has a lot of weight. So enunciation, articulating the suppressed, the overlooked, the previously unsaid, unsayable side of our collective social production. To enunciate is essentially to give voice to those who are not able to speak. So the lawyer enunciates for the layperson to the judge. The Magna Carta enunciates for the population to the king. And the reason why I'm citing something like the Magna Carta is because the way that citizens interact with government and legal culture is still just the same. So I could say the Bill of Rights, and we could have this farce in our head that we have a different set of freedoms than were enacted from the Magna Carta. And at the end of the day, um, I don't know. I It's bleak. It's bleak for me this morning. Um, it's actually not that bleak, but anyway. Um, but this idea of enunciation and marginality are important things to really think about. And so um, think about where you feel as though you are marginalized, and think about who, for whom your artwork is enunciating. Is your artwork enunciating only for you? And if that's the case, what power struggle or what power system, what hegemonic authority is it voicing your opinions to? Are you speaking for a broad group of people? If that's the case, are those people part of this project and part of that enunciation? Or are you, like Hiller or like the lawyer, translating it so that it can be said or understood by a broader culture? There's there are big political and psychological ramifications for both of those conversations, and neither one of them is something that you have to adhere to, right? We all have lives, and we all have the freedom to live those lives as we see fit, and as such, well, yeah, go forth, be yourself, um, and so, um, yeah, Susan Hiller and those quotes. I'm already at 30 minutes, or getting nearing 30 minutes, and I don't want to make this too much longer than an hour. So what I think makes sense is to kind of go through a little bit of these slides and just make some references that I think are important to the texts that are around. So self, the positionality, all of us as makers have to at some point come to terms with who we are as a maker. That means that we need to figure out, am I, like, how marginalized am I? Am I, am I marginalized at all? Is my work marginalized at all? Is my work trying to enunciate? Should my work be trying to enunciate? Those are things we have just always plaguing us in the back of our head. I totally deviated there. I'm sorry. It's still early and I'm still getting over whatever I had. Essentially, what I'm saying is that all of us all of you have to, at some point, articulate who you are. And you can do it along simple demographic lines. I am a gay white male from North America. And with our current conversations about privilege and about race and about well, essentially just privilege and race, there's a lot that's out there in the world right now on these topics. And so we have things that, reasons why we need to say these things out loud. And because of that, a lot of the conversations about positional politics these days, or a lot of the way that artists are having them, are really specific to what is directly happening today. And as important as I understand that to be, and as important as it is to be a politically aware person, even if you're not directly politically active, what I'm asking is something that's a little broader than that. I don't want you to necessarily define yourself against ideas of the 99%, or against ideas, or within the framework of ideas of Black Lives Matter movement. Those are incredibly important things, conversations that are happening right now, and you should understand where your opinion lies. But when we talk about positionality and we talk about self, we're really talking about the full thing. How able do you feel, how able do you feel to speak for yourself? Do you feel as though you have a voice in this culture? Do you feel as though you are marginalized from speaking in certain instances? These are important questions, and these are, especially as makers, these are important things to understand. Do you feel as though your work has the ability to move forward because of who you are, or is something about your political and social and cultural identity stopping your work from developing? If so, what is that, and how can you break away from that? Now, a lot of the artists that we're going to look at today are all dealing with what it is to be a woman in an Islamic country, what the limitations are, what the advantages are. The advantages are really only articulated in the Battle of Algiers, where we have people using strategic invisibility to kind of dip in and out of danger zones as a means to stoke a revolution. What we're going to talk about here is really the limitations. What limitations are put on the body, the female body, within these confines? So pause for just a sec. Oh, too fast of a second. I know it was like really like clip, 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 clip. All of a sudden I have a cup in my hand. Maybe next time I'll have like a witch hat. I don't have a witch hat. So Shireen Neshat is making work that often deals with a divide. And what I should have done, what I am not going to do, never mind, scratch that. What Shireen Neshat does is gives you always this cleaved image with her video work. She makes photo-based work where she writes Islamic text, Quranic text on her skin and body and everything, and takes a lot of self-portraits. She's an Iranian woman, and so she's coming from a very hardline Islamic culture. She's coming from a culture that that takes to use Bikram's, not Bikram, excuse me, Bilgrami's conversation. She takes the fundaments, Iran takes the fundaments of the Quran very seriously. It's a very fundamentalist country. That said, all of the artists that we're looking at have at their core the fundamental association with Islamic faith, with the Islamic faith. All of us in this country have a fundamental relationship to Judeo-Christian religious organization based on our use of certain calendars, based on our associations for certain holidays, so on and so forth. So we all, and this is why I think as awkward of a text as it is to read, the Bilgrami text is actually really interesting to deal with, because I don't know about you, but while I was reading it, there was this constant conversation with, okay, who am I? What would I say? And there was oh man, as weird as it sounds, some of you might be too young to remember these news stories, but when the mass shootings happened at Columbine, this one story started circulating around where one of the shooters put a gun to a young woman's head and asked her if she believed in God. And when she said yes, she was assassinated. And even though I kind of walked through my daily life thinking very agnostic thoughts about how the world has been shaped and what the world is, and I'm saying that as I'm looking out the window, looking at sunlight and things, I wonder what I would say in that instance. What would I say? What is my fundamental relationship here? And that's the thing I really like about Bilgrami's conversation, and this is something to think about in bringing readers into your writing in the future. By starting off with this little quippy anecdote about someone asking him if he's Islamic and him saying yes, even though he doesn't actually identify as an Islamic man or go to temple, go to services as an Islamic man, it's fundamental to who he is because it's his worldview. So just an interesting thought, and sorry for bringing up such an aggressive conversation about Columbine to make that point, because that's a little awkward. But anyway, Shireen Neshat identifies fundamentally as an Islamic woman, and that's tried and true. Not all of the artists that we're going to look at today, or that you have all been studying for some time, identify as such. But one of the things that Neshat gets at with her work is something that I think is outlined pretty specifically in Ortner's text. The division between a male world and a female world. And The male world, according to Ortner, is shaped by culture, is found fundamentally linked to culture, whereas the woman's world is fundamentally linked to nature. Now, one of the things that always occurs in Nishat's divisional videos, or these two channel video projections, is this, where in this image you can see we have a man who's imaged with a lot of other men in a room speaking, and on the other panel we have a woman who's in a room that's pretty empty, totally empty. She is by herself. She is not speaking. And the distinction here between speaking through a technological device to a group of an audience of peers is the definition of culture. Whereas being silent and passively absorbing the environment around you is having or declaring a proximity to nature. Now, I understand that in different scenes there's different social arrangements, and there are certainly instances in a lot of Nishat's videos where women are not necessarily imaged alone, but what is often the case is that men are given a different agency in culture, and women are withheld from those purviews. Now, for those of you who have not been inside of a mosque, really quickly I'll let you know that there's a large area where men can walk in, shoes off, can walk in and pray and congregate and hang out. And there are certain places where women are allowed and certain places where women are not allowed. Often there are different doorways where women enter and men enter. This kind of segregation exists pretty predominantly in the mosque. It doesn't necessarily translate out into other parts of the sidewalk. People, and when in Istanbul, I watched people, families, walking towards the mosque, and they would say their goodbyes, a little peck on the cheek, very sweet, and then the men would go in the one door, and the women would take the child and go into the other door, because the other place was where women and children could exist, and men existed in one arena. The men spoke of business, spoke of culture. The women spoke of their lives, spoke of their families, probably also, as was evidenced in the film that some of you may not have seen, that women were also talking about culture. And that's why I read that one last quote by Ortner, that these divisions are total malarkey. They're not founded in anything, but in fact they exist in only in the psychology. And so with someone like Sukran Moral, with her project, I love Sukran Moral. I just, cat's meow. This video, I just think is all of the videos, all the works that I'm familiar with by her are great. But what she deals with head on is the ridiculousness of these conversations and of these restrictions that what of the rules placed on women, what of the limitations placed on women, why these limitations, why these rules. And so for her, one of the main cruxes of her investigation deals specifically with the female association or proximity to sexuality, specifically sex for pay, or at least in some of the works that I'm more familiar with, the idea of the bordello is really important. She confronts the male gaze by incorporating a video camera, internalizing the gaze into her practice. The camera's looking at her, gazing at her body, in as much as it's turning back out and looking at the lascivious men who laugh at her, and some of the men who actually will think about the potential of visiting that bordello later, while most of the men, in keeping with good cultural standards and good family moral codes, are going to walk right by the bordello. There actually are not that many bordellos in the Islamic world. They're going to just judge her and move on. And what Moral is saying, I think, with these works is she's equating this proximity to sex as kind of a microcosm for the relationship that women have within the Islamic world. Now, Moral starts with this conversation a list of artists who are predominantly based in Turkey, and Turkey being a fairly relaxed Islamic country doesn't have a lot of the really strict rules that are evidenced in the work by Shireen Nishat. Women have more rights. I saw a lot of women driving cars. I saw a lot of women without headscarves on. I saw a lot of women on their own at night at clubs. Um, I saw a lot of women taking agency over their own lives, having apartments, having essentially it all, right? All while still being restricted and still being demeaned in certain ways. And that's what Morale is getting at. With sexual liberation, which was the impetus that brought with it the real aggressive turn in feminist discourse and the real aggressive turn in all the right ways. I say aggressive in like real positive ways. We've all benefited from these struggles. Um, uh, but we went from suffragette, which is very certainly not apologist and certainly not quiet, but uh, after the sexual revolution, the feminist movement got very different, right? All of a sudden, it wasn't just about burning your bra; it was about being sex positive and owning your own sex and owning your own desires and being forward and direct about those desires and getting what you want. Um, and uh, so for Morale, the conversation is bringing those things, identifying the microcosm that is sexuality and expanding it into the broader feminist discourse. And within the framework of Turkey, to do this under the guise of a false bordello is very risky. There are violences against women in every country around the world at an incredibly disgusting rate. And so it's not necessarily the safest thing in the world to pretend that you're a prostitute inside of a country that um, every country does have prostitutes, but when a country has, well, it's just dangerous. I don't have to say any more than that. It's just dangerous. There's really not that much to say about um, the work of of uh, of Ilgaz. It's so patient and so quiet, and in the face of the kind of boisterous, um, very sexually assertive Sukran Moral, this work, albeit very sexually suggestive with the spread legs in this image and the split frame, the work deals a lot more with the idea of invisibility and the idea of even in this image that I'm showing you here, we're meant to look out past the legs and kind of see the female body as something, as merely a means of passage and not necessarily something uh, towards veneration. um, Again, thinking to the Battle of Algiers, the idea of invisibility being useful has its merits, but for Ilgaz, being invisible has its detractions. Um, there's a lot of the work of Sophie Calle in the background of my head, in my head while I'm looking at these works. Um, but I'm watching this clock and I'm trying to get quick. So Incy's work. Okay, really quickly. Um, so I know that this was a really difficult project to try and get yourself into, but essentially, you walk into Istanbul Modern, excuse me, and this is the installation view. So it's a very large wall that's wallpapered with all of these various kinds of repeating insignia, all rooted in Turkish culture. And then you can see there are these three videos that are inlaid into this wall, these video screens. On each of these video screens, there is another pattern very similar, probably pulling directly from a Turkish from Turkish cultural production at some point. I mean, Turkey has thousands of years of cultural production, so Inci has quite a lot to mine through. But what she does is inside of these little patterns, she embeds videos of herself in all manner of costumes, usually some sort of like nude stocking thing, Um, and she records herself making one gesture, whether that gesture is rolling her eyes, whether that gesture is doing this, whether that gesture is like this. And then she repeats it in the same way that the motifs on the wallpaper and the motifs in the background of the videos are repeated. And so her gestures become repeated insignia within this cultural vocabulary. Um, there's a woman who just had a show recently in New York City. I missed it actually, called Martine Sims, or it's either Martine or Martique. I can't remember, but Sims is the last name. And her whole project was about developing a vocabulary um, of gestures and movements that come from Black female culture, but have been appropriated more broadly into conversations, uh, into other parts of culture. Um, and so she's kind of trying to catalog them. And there's so much of what INSEE's doing in that kind of work. And I felt really privileged to be able to see these works in Turkey. She shows around every once in a while. Her work will pop up in the United States, but they're in Europe fairly frequently. So maybe we'll get the opportunity to see them at some point. But they're really, really cool. And the idea of equating a female gesture to kind of the invisible, repeated thing in the background, I think is kind of interesting. I will say, though, that in certain videos, the her female disposition is present, or her female body is more present. In other, it's really just a body. And so I'm not sure whether or not INSEE, and I'm just Eviner, excuse me, INSEE Eviner. In Eviner's work, she is potentially not really talking necessarily about gender or gender binary. She could just be exploring the full breadth of it. And she's a fairly young artist, and that's kind of where the androgyny or the queer body, the body of no gender, is has been of interest to a lot of performance artists. So I wouldn't be surprised if she's doing that. And this, oh my God, just what a beautiful, oh, so pretty. If you really, if you like this idea of like a face cut out with just the wall around it, look at a project by a woman named Katie Vida, Vida, um, that she did with, what's it called? Prime Time is the name of the gallery. Katie Vida at Prime Time. Crystal, I'm looking at you. Neil Yalter. This was an older video where Yalter essentially went around and, or the video that I saw at Istanbul Modern is her going around kissing everything and laying her lips on the entire surface of her environment and videotaping it. Now, this has a lot of antecedents in performance practices or comparators in performance practice in the Western world. Someone like Joan Jonas, or even someone like Valley Expor, I think are people to look at as Western comparators. But that doesn't mean that we should not or subjugate Yalter's work to Western ideologies or Western eyes. The fact of the matter is that Yalter's work exists entirely within the domestic setting. The only reason, the only place where she is free to do these kinds of actions and essentially to be in this state of undress is within a domestic sphere. And so this idea of the semiotics of the kitchen being this like, I'm going to commandeer and like absorb the discourses so that they fit into my domestic setting seemed very powerful for someone like Martha Rosler. But for someone like Yalter, although there is a certain agency and authority and awesomeness to this project, it does feel a little bit as though she's trapped, kind of like Rapunzel in the tower. She's destined to kind of live out this circuitous life of wanting a physical pleasure, wanting to give physical pleasure, but only having the domestic setting inside of which to do so. So she's kissing the table, she's kissing the wall, but at the same time, those objects are kissing her back. And this kind of conversation about being essentially a prisoner of domesticity is certainly something that that feminists in the United States have dealt with and feminists around the world are continuing to deal with. So, um, slightly different context. Hang on. Sorry about that. So to switch speed a little bit, we are now going to look at the work of Yüksel Arslan, who is um, a male artist, but in this work and in this work and in all of his work, he deals a lot with just the body in general. And one of the things I really appreciate about this work is its relationship to the antecedents of feminism before feminism was really pronounced. Now, this work was created in a time when the Western world certainly had feminist discourses, but it was not a time when the Turkish world had necessarily a lot of them. But Arslan had a relationship to the Surrealist movement, and so had an understanding of conversations about identity politics more broadly. Now, one of the things that I find really interesting about this is the Surrealist movement is by and large a really misogynistic movement. They didn't like women that much, and if women were assertive, they were lumped into the category of femme fatale, and they were deemed dangerous and potentially subversive. Now, for Arslan, while I'm not that entirely familiar with his oeuvre, I am not, in all the work that I have seen, I haven't seen that kind of misogyny or that kind of fear of woman evidenced. Instead, in images like this, which is of a factory scene where we have a lot of female employees churning away, there is a sense of there's a male component to this, as a male counterpart to this work as well, where it's men in a factory. And so this idea that there is a certain level of equality in objectification is, for my eyes, interesting to come out of a country that a country like Turkey and a movement like Surrealism. So in this work, we have the fracturing of all of these various bodies, and while certainly there are more male bodies in this image than there are female bodies, the mere equality of bodies across the board, all the same scale, all disembodied in similar ways, in ways that are deemed both humorous and disconcerting, evidences a different kind of psychology than one that was playing out within the Surrealist movement in the late 1930s. That movement, like I said, was very afraid of female empowerment. What Arslan seems to be more engaged with is a sense of we're all equal. And this idea of the male feminist is something that we all need to get used to. Um, yeah, and it's really frustrating right now. Feminism is in this really horrible place because there's so many people who claim that they're not feminists, even though there are women in the United States who vote. And it makes me so sad to hear that kind of idiocy. It's like if you had any understanding of yourself, of your identity, of your position, or of the culture that your position is created by, then you would understand that you have to identify as a feminist if you are a woman who casts a ballot. If you aren't a feminist, then stop voting. And actually, maybe that'll diminish a lot of the Christian conservatism. Um, but that's just real talk on a video lecture. Surhe Hira. Now, this body of work is, I find, really interesting and presents a little bit more the conversation that was played out by Judith Butler, which, if you didn't give that as good of a read as I really want you to, it's going to come back up when we in the next cache, because the next cache is about collaboration and performance, and that obviously deals a lot pretty heavily with performance, or how we perform gender, we perform sexuality, we perform the cultural caches that we find ourselves within. And so what Hera has done, not only in this body of work, but in other instances, in using these masks of Muhammad, which obviously are really problematic, she is here. They are here, actually. I'm pretty sure it's she. I should have looked into that. I feel really bad for not knowing that. But actually, I don't feel really bad because it doesn't matter. We're all equal, and makers are makers. And these two bodies I know are not that of the photographer. They are, in fact, two homosexual men. Um, I believe this photograph comes from a series shoot they were working on in Palestine, um, where the men are obviously engaged in a kind of proximity, not necessarily hypersexualized. We're just seeing shirtless men. We're just seeing one by the front, one by the back. Um, Given the distance between these, the kneeling man doesn't actually seem to be making any contact with the body of the other man, but they are in incredible proximity to one another. And so that kind of homosocial interaction is pretty resoundingly condemned across the Islamic world. Even in a place like Istanbul, it's hard to be a gay person. If you're a gay person, it's not against the law, so you're not going to die the vicious deaths that are currently being that are currently occurring in other countries. But you might get beaten up, and the gay clubs that are there are very clandestine and quiet, and they're very different than Western gay clubs. But one of the things that I find really interesting about this series, specifically the relationship to the Muhammad, is there's a tradition within the Islamic world called the Hilye, Hilye, or Hilya, depending on which country you're talking about. And the Hilya is a text-based thing. It's like a wall mounted thing. So it has a lot of similarities to a painting, but it's all text. And what the text is of, it's a part of the Quran where the body of Muhammad is addressed. You can't make images of the of Muhammad, but you can reference his body. And the referencing of his body by male authors for male readers has a certain proximation to homosocial tendencies or homosocial behavior. And I'm saying homosocial, not homosexual, because the proximity of two male bodies or two female bodies doesn't indicate a sexual relationship, it indicates a social relationship. And while certainly in the Islamic world and in almost everywhere else on the planet, two men who are not having a sexual relationship can walk arm in arm. It's a way to indicate that I'm speaking to you and you're speaking to me. We might even hold hands because I'm telling the world that we are speaking and that you are an important person to me. It was real fun to hold hands and walk arm in arm with my husband in Istanbul because we just looked like two guys out on the town. Little did they know um, that our matching jewelry. Uh, so that kind of homosocial instances are or homosocial behavior is something that's seen in the Islamic world, but the thing that the Hilye put forth is, I mean, they're pretty saucy. Like they go into a lot of detail about what that prophet looked like, about where his body hair was and what it looked like, what the hair of his beard must have felt like. I mean, these are they're devotional, uh, and certainly Christianity has its relationship to the body of Christ, but this is a very different thing. And so to see these images and to think about this idea of one man imagining the body of the Prophet Muhammad, um, and potentially having a sexual relation or having a sexual connotation to that read is so against the rules and so volatile, but also so punchy and direct and like, I mean, you got to know the full cultural story for these photographs to really resonate as such. But when you do, it's really just like, okay, wow. Um, and Jose, your relationship to religion and sexuality, I think, is something that's interesting. has an interesting parallel to Hera's work here. So, and now I'm back where we began, and I'm nearing my 1 hour mark. And so, um, with that, I just I'll close by talking about the Keelan text, because the Keelan text, especially after all of these conversations about terrorists, about, oh my gosh, um, that's what the Keelan text is about. It's about terrorists, but in the face of, um, it's a different kind of terrorist conversation, because instead of a terrorist that we identify with, or that we identify as an Islamic terrorist, Al Qaeda, ISIS, or whatever. What Keelan is actually addressing is the terrorist implications of growing your hair long, and the subtle distinction between what is deemed as culturally normative and what is deemed as culturally disruptive, I think, is really, really, really interesting. Now, is it the most intellectually engaging text? Well, no, of course not. It came from this magazine, um, Journal, which is an arts magazine, contemporary art magazine, from the Institute of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and it's from 1987. Um, the Keelan text comes from a few years prior to that. Uh, but this idea that you'll get spit on if you grow your hair long because you're deemed a terrorist, because you're terrorizing, you're not terrorizing in the sense that you're blowing up buildings or kidnapping people or sending horrible threats. You're a terrorist because when good, mild mannered, normative people walk down the street and they see your long hair, they're going to think, oh man, that guy's terrorizing my good sensibilities. Now, is Iyam doing anything like that? Not necessarily. Are the majority of artists at play in this cache doing something similar to that? Not necessarily. But the reason why I found it important to assign that text was A, its readability, it's pretty quick to get through, but B, the idea that a position is not necessarily something that, I'm going to restate that. Positionality is something that you both have to fight for and fight against. You will meet antagonism by pronouncing your positionality, no matter what your positionality is. If you're a, a, a heterosexual liberal in New York City, you still have to defend your positionality against the kind of aggression that people will put out towards you. So, I know this was kind of there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of different perspectives here, but um, kind of I'll tie it all together sloppily as I did this lecture, to essentially say that, you know, um, everything that we engage with is a cultural construct. Everything that we engage with is a culture that we put into in as much as we take out of. Our position is defined by the hegemony that we exist within. And in certain instances, we have to see our positionality as being advantageous in as much as it is problematic. And so, think again to the Battle of Algiers and the ability of women, by being seen as passive, by being seen as delicate, by being seen as a lot of the words that feminism across the world is trying to take apart or take away from female identity. Those things were used as strengths. Now, were the women in that film happy that they were marginalized to that point? Probably not. But did they see that as advantageous against their colonizers? Yes, and they used it strategically. And so I don't think that all of you as artists need to go around constantly spouting off your positionality within the capitalist hegemony that we exist within in this country. Rather, think critically about your positionality and find ways to make it strategically useful for you moving forward. Is it important to make work as a feminist just because you're a female artist? Is it important to evidence your queerness in the face of your artistic production? Do these things matter? Does your political ideology have to be in your artwork, or can it actually be one step removed? This is why this conversation is so important. And the objectiveness of looking at a culture and an identity that we are all removed from, that of the Islamic female, I think gives us the kind of distance that we can potentially generate some interesting ideas from. And so with that, I'm going to say so long, farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, and it's daytime, so I'm not going to say goodnight. And yeah, the whole time I've been watching this video, this little clip of me thinking I need to go and get a haircut, but I'm not going to do that now. So, see y'all.